Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about Elizabeth Wayland Barber's book, Women's Work, and a couple of other books and ideas, and brought together into a talk called Clothes Make the Woman. This is probably the ur-fetish, including this discussion, and it's by Kathleen Lowrey. And Kathleen is here. She's going to explain that. She pre-recorded. She's here and she'll answer questions, chat to us at the end, but pre-recorded because it's so late at night. So we're going to hear now from Kathleen. Welcome.
All right. Hi. I decided to record this in advance because I am here, but I decided to record it in advance because this is very early in the morning for me, and I thought it might be a little more alert if I recorded it in the afternoon, but I will wake up as I listen to it and we can discuss it at the end. Thank you so much for having me again. I think last time I was here, I talked about the work of Maria Gimbutas, and now I'm talking again about the anthropological study of the role of women. So I'll actually be talking about three authors today, but probably the most important is Elizabeth Wayland Barber. I know probably many people in the audience are familiar with her wonderful book, Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years. It was originally published in 1994 and has been reissued in a 30th anniversary edition last year in 2024. So during the course of this talk, I will draw on the work of three women, all of whom are feminists, but not all are our kind of feminists. In the case of one of these authors, I'll be reading her work kind of against the grain. But I wanted to begin by saying, and I know people in this audience know, but I often say this to students, what does it mean to be a radical feminist? And it doesn't mean being like, necessarily the most kind of rah-rah revolutionary feminist. What it really means is being a feminist who goes to the root, who really wants to think about the root of women's oppression and sort of the historical unfolding. This is out of fashion, I would say, in scholarship generally, certainly in activism. It's very out of fashion in anthropology. It's one of the reasons given is it's suggested that if you want to think too much about origins, that you're kind of on the side of racists, that racists like to think about human origins. It's certainly true that there are plenty of origin-obsessed racists in the world, but I don't believe, and I'm sure you all don't believe, that the efforts that have been put into warning scholars away from thinking about origins and long-term trends really are benevolent or genuinely on the side of anti-racism. I think the motivation is that if you can't think about origins, you can't think about long-term trends, you can't think about long patterns. Being able to think about these things mean that you can think without, experiencing the world as if you were born yesterday. Being a radical feminist means you prepare yourself to notice when things that are sold as novel and cutting edge and like, whoa, the world is so crazy, what we're experiencing, we've never experienced before, you are able to notice, actually, I think this is old as dirt. I think this is an old thing being repackaged as a new thing. So in anthropology specifically, one of the charges that's often made about anthropologists who like to think about trends and patterns is that we're falling into the trap of being social evolutionists, which is social evolutionism is a bad racism. Again, it's compared to racism, that you're not supposed to think about development across the long term because that might cause you to think of some societies as being more advanced than other societies or more developed than other societies. You're just supposed to think of like every culture is special in its own way, which of course is true. Every culture is special in its own way. But if you can't think about development, if you refuse to think about these kinds of trends, it's not just that you're going to protect yourself from making hierarchies between societies. You're also going to be less able to notice patterns of intensification, intensification of exploitation, intensification of oppression. And I think it's important to be able to think about these kinds of patterns, both as a feminist, but just in general, if we look at the world that we live in today, there seems to be a real intensification of exploitation, a real intensification of stratification, an intensification of oppression. And it's important to be able to think about this, to notice certain strategies and techniques that are used, that continue to be used, that are refined and used in new and dangerous ways, but that are also continuous with similar techniques that have been used in the past. So I would say it is at the very least interesting, and I know I'm speaking to the choir and preaching to the choir here, but that the kind of thinking that radical feminism encourages, which is looking at roots, looking at development over time, looking for patterns and trends, putting evidence together, that it's much more we go at the world as if we're doing a crime scene investigation. And the crime that we're interested in is how did the oppression of women happen? How did the position of women, which in so many respects is absolutely criminal, how did this happen? That's really discouraged in the present world. It's discouraged as a way of training young people. It's discouraged as a method of scholarship in favor of like, what, we don't even know, like what even is a woman? Like everything is fluid, man, that we should be thinking about things like queer futurities, some kind of future that we might sort of be floating towards on a cloud, rather than like, what are the patterns that have gotten us where we are? Who's at fault? What kind of strategies and techniques should we be suspicious about? All of that is, instead of putting things together, we're encouraged to deconstruct. We're encouraged to think not in terms of structures, but like, oh, let's be post-structural. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I think it's interesting that scholars and young people being trained in scholarship are being warded off the kind of thinking that radical feminism encourages you to engage in, and this is the kind of thinking I'm going to be engaged in what I present today. Okay, so of the three women scholars I'm going to be drawing upon, the first one is Elizabeth Whelan Barber, born in 1940, still with us. I've actually had the opportunity to interview her. She's really smart and funny and wonderful. She's most famous as a scholar of textile history, although she's done other kinds of work. She began a genuinely new line of inquiry by taking cloth and weaving seriously, which has principally been women's work. Now, this is probably part of the reason that it hasn't been paid very much attention to, or at least wasn't at the time that she became interested in it, that it wasn't receiving serious attention from historians and from archaeologists. She's a hobby weaver herself. She noticed things in, particularly in ancient Greek images. She saw stuff that she thought was woven cloth, and her professors at the time, she was an undergraduate, and her professors said, no, loom weaving techniques were very simplistic. They couldn't have been making complex cloth of that kind. And she knew enough about weaving to know, like, well, it's not that hard to make patterns in cloth. So she became interested in the whole question of cloth. When I interviewed her, she said she thought that she would gather information and she would write like an article about textiles, and she quickly found there was so much understudied information out there that she had enough for a book. She published a scholarly book in 1991, and then her famous popular book in 1994. So I'm not saying that current anthropologists talk about man the toolmaker, although we know this is an older phrase for like, what is the history of man? The history of man is man the toolmaker, that we speak of the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. We tend to think of these hard implements used by men. Now, part of that is just because hard stuff preserves better in the archaeological record than soft stuff, but part of it is also because in a body of scholarship that was founded and long dominated by men, paying more attention to the kinds of things that men make and use was popular. So this shaped our idea of like, what is the trajectory of human development? Elizabeth Whelan Barber, by paying attention to textiles and noticing how long textiles have been around, how early people figured out to make complex textiles, she started to think, you know, I think that textiles have also been an important tool of human development, of human technological advance. When she wrote her book, she said women's work the first 20,000 years. She said we've been making cloth for at least 20,000 years. Now, really thanks to the line of inquiry that she initiated, people have started looking for cloth and textiles and fiber technology in the archaeological record. The most recent find is a piece of woven string that was made by Neanderthals 50,000 years ago. And I will just say in general, if we find something that's 50,000 years old, and especially find something soft that was 50,000 years old, we know it was there sooner, right? Like this stuff disintegrates very easily across time. So if we found something 50,000 years old, that already tells you, if we even found one piece of it, there was a lot of it around. And if there was a lot of it around 50,000 years ago, it goes back to longer than 50,000 years ago. But anyway, Elizabeth Wayland Barber came up with the term, the string revolution, in order to compete, not to compete with, but to be comparable to things like when we talk about the Neolithic, which is new stone tool technologies, that were revolutionary for human technological development. She said, look, coming up with string would have allowed tremendous advances, because if you think about how useful string is, if you can make rope, if you can make nets for catching things, catching fish, if you can weave bags for carrying things, well, you're off to the races in so many ways. Imagine all the things you can do once you have rope, net, and bags that you couldn't do before you had these things. So Barber did, as I've already said, tremendous work in finding everything that was sort of mentioned in the published literature. So what she started out just looking at archaeological site reports that mentioned textiles but didn't focus on the textiles particularly, and she started to find there was so much even in archaeological site reports that hadn't been really analyzed. And then she also visited many collections, and she found stuff that people were like, oh, we found all these cool, like, let's say metal tools or stone tools, and oh, we found, you know, some evidence that there were string bags, or we even found some textiles, but we piled them over in a corner. And she went and started to look at these things really closely. She was herself a weaver, and she was quite interested in figuring out what were the means by which these cloths were made, what kind of looms were being used. So it's really a fascinating book for what she was able to figure out. And she was truly a foundational figure. Like, this is not a story of a sad woman scholar whose interesting work was ignored. This is an example of a woman who looked into something no one else had paid much attention to, and really started an entire body of an entire subdiscipline of work. So archaeologists and historians do pay much more attention to fiber and cloth than they used to do. Okay, but not only would cloth be useful in that string revolution sense that she meant, and she also noticed the way that cloth is uniquely useful as a symbolic medium. So cloth, before you have writing systems, cloth can be a kind of document that you can encode information, you can weave information into cloth, and you can transfer cloth more easily than other, you know, cloth is lightweight, you can crunchel it up, you can fold it and put it away, it can travel long distances, it can contain messages, it can convey messages when you wear it about who you are, what kind of person you are, who your group is, what kind of status that you have. Some of you may already know this is a figurine called the Venus of Lasp. I don't know, I think it's someplace in France, I don't know exactly how you pronounce it, but one of the things Barber noticed, this is one of the ways she figured out we had to have been making at least string as long as 20,000 years ago, is on this Venus of Lasp, there is what had thought to be just decoration, like, oh, this is a female, like one of those so-called goddess figurines, and they've kind of decorated it. You know, and she said, no, this isn't just a decoration. This is obviously a representation of weaving, because you can see here, there's a braided pattern, and at the end of the braided pattern, there's strings hanging down, just like when you braid your hair, at the end you have loose string. And she said, look, there's no way you would etch that onto a figurine unless you were representing cloth. You wouldn't carefully show the braiding and the strings hanging down unless this is a representation of something this woman figure is wearing. Now, so this told her two things. One, it told her we knew how to make a piece of textile this complicated at least 20,000 years ago, because this figurine is about 25,000 years old. But the other thing she noticed is how early and how often sort of aprons reoccurred. So some kind of material worn around a woman's waist or hips. And I can't go into everything she says about this. She says tons of interesting things about this, but I just wanted to remark, since I talked about Maria Gimbutas the last time I was here, is now that we're starting to understand how old fiber technologies actually are, that human beings have known how to weave string for at least 50,000 years ago, at least 50,000 years, we probably knew how to make stuff like this as long as 50,000 years ago, that some of the figurines and the iconography that seems to represent women, that many scholars have interpreted as having something to do with women's fertility, that the stuff on them might not actually be just decoration. It might actually be representation of stuff that they were supposed to be wearing, right? And what's interesting is how often they're wearing stuff around their pelvis and their hips. So now, we could say if we interpret this as like these are female iconography that represent a high status for women, or religious beliefs around a goddess or an earth mother or some kind of female figure that has a lot of spiritual power, it's interesting. It's interesting that the pelvic area is emphasized and decorated. So this could be like are you holding the power of fertility? Are you increasing the power of fertility? Are you protecting the power of fertility? Are you kind of trapping the power of fertility? Now, all of this could have been perhaps part of some idea of women having this being part of the special power of women, the people creating power of women being something special that one would want to keep and protect. But as we'll come to discuss, this could also have been one of the places that you got the genesis of the notion that you could imbue an object with that people-making power, and you could take that object and transfer it, which could have been part of the initial moments of that symbolic understanding of women's fertility as something that could be appropriated and taken away, right? and transferred to others, transacted among men. Okay, so just bear with me. I'm going to build that case. All right, the next person whose work I'm going to draw on is an anthropologist named Annette Weiner. Unless you're an anthropologist, it's unlikely that you've heard of her. She's a little older than Elizabeth Wayland Barber, but she passed away from I'm not sure what kind of cancer, but she's sort of at like the peak of her career. She unfortunately died of cancer. She conducted fieldwork on the Trobriand Islands, which were initially made famous by Bronislaw Melanowski. He did fieldwork there in the 1920s. He wrote about a kind of trade that he called the Cooler Ring, which was the Trobriands are out near Papua New Guinea. They're islands off the coast of Papua New Guinea. And men there engaged in this trade that in one direction they transacted shell necklaces, and the other direction they transacted shell armbands. And this is kind of competitive trade that men have partners on other islands, and they're always constantly hoping to get one of the sort of shell valuables that's kind of most high status, because if you can bring home that shell valuable to your village, then people are like, wow, you're such a big deal. And you get to hold it for a while, but then eventually you have to transact it on to another partner who's participating in the trade in the other direction. But when people know that you have this high status shell valuable, men who are hoping to be the one you pick to transact it to, like give you presents and they flatter, you're just like a big deal while you hold that shell valuable, you become famous. So it's a hard good, and I'm emphasizing this hard versus soft because it's going to come up again. It's a hard good that brings with it prestige. It's been compared in some ways to things like sports trophies. Like if we can bring home the sports trophy, like, oh, we'll be such a big deal. So this is like male status competition. Now, Annette Weiner, Melanowski wrote in the 1920s. She did her fieldwork and wrote her first book in the 1970s, and she was interested in two things that had not interested Melanowski. One is the role of women, And the other is the problem of hierarchy. Now, these are both feminist questions, right? The problem of why is women's status low, and the role of women generally in society. Now, Melanowski had described the Kula trait as reciprocal, that men kind of, sometimes it's your turn to get a high status valuable, sometimes it's your turn to give away the high status valuable, but that he didn't really emphasize status jockeying as much as, but Weiner noticed that actually the Kula trait was not particularly reciprocal, that there were many more losers than winners in Kula. So there was lots of men hoping to get a high status item, but very few men who actually succeeded at any point in their lifetime to getting a high status item. And officially all the rules of Kula are that you're supposed to, if you get a high status item, you're supposed to hold it for a while and then pass it along. But men who got a really high status item tended to hog it for longer than they were supposed to. They tried to hold it for like 10, sometimes even 20 years. Meanwhile, like everybody's like, oh, giving them presents because they want to be the one to get it. So she was like, this seems to be really a way for men to differentiate themselves and for some men to succeed and other men to lose. She also noticed that women had their own non-utilitarian trade. Oh, I should mention that one thing that was important about Melanowski's writing is in the 1920s, people had assumed that like so-called primitives or savages only engaged in kind of subsistence. Like they would only care about getting enough to eat and getting enough, you know, tents over their heads or whatever, where he was like, no, they have this complex kind of economic transaction that is not just driven by utilitarian needs. She noticed that women had a kind of wealth of their own that was soft wealth that principally consisted of banana leaf bundles. And so they transacted tons of banana leaf bundles, but they also transacted a certain number of skirts. And again, there are these skirts that are around the pelvis. And these transactions were associated with the life course, that women transacted huge numbers of banana leaves in mortuary rituals. So when somebody dies, the women would do what they called paying the debts of the dead person. The mortuary transactions could be quite simple if a child died, but if a high status man or woman died who was quite elderly, these would be an all-day affair. You'd give away tens of thousands of banana leaf bundles. And what you gave, they marked all the relationships this person had during their life. So a really important person would have had a lot of relationships. And at the mortuary ritual, everybody sees how important this person was. They see who their most important relationships were with, because those people get a big pile of banana leaf bundles. If you only had a minor relationship, you got a few banana leaf bundles. And then there was a lot of competition among women for who would be the one who would run the mortuary ritual. And the woman who runs the mortuary ritual, she's an older woman. She gets to wear this very long banana skirt made of banana leaf bundles. And there are other kinds of skirts get given away. There are skirts that you get, so this is a thing that happens at the time of death, but other kinds of skirts that gets transacted among women are you get from your sisters-in-law, you get kind of a medium length skirt when you get married. And then young women who are unmarried wear these short skirts that really emphasize the hips that are bright red. So they wear really colorful, bright skirts. Anyway, so the life course is marked with this soft wealth that it's women's wealth, and it's also used to make this kind of fertility emphasis decoration. Okay, so the Trobrians are not a very hierarchical society. The kinship system is matrilineal, and there are not really permanent status classes. So there's this jockeying among men, and some men do a lot better than other men. There's also these sort of displays on the occasion of people's deaths where you see who was a big deal and who were their big deal relationships with. But there's not inherited status, there's not an aristocracy, there's not a royal lineage. Now, Weiner became interested in the problem of, is there a way that you could knit together men's status jockeying with this kind of symbolic life course wealth? And if you could knit those things together, that would give you a symbolic medium that would allow you to create more permanent status hierarchies. So if you had special objects that are imbued with life force and which convey status, that means some people kind of hold more life than others, or this is not Weiner's phrase, but my phrase, that some people are more person than other people are. Now, what's interesting is she started to find that textiles recur as a medium for exactly this. First, she looked in Polynesia. So this is a picture from Samoa, which not Samoa. This is a picture from New Zealand. These are Maori people. Maori society is much more hierarchical than Trobriand society. And one of the things that's important for conveying messages about status is precisely cloth. So these are feather cloaks worn by Maori aristocrats. Weiner looked first in Oceania, and she looked at very stratified societies like Hawaiian societies, Maori societies, Samoan societies. These are just traditional societies that had royal lineages, that had aristocrats, that also had slaves, in which permanent hierarchies were transmitted across generations. And she said, you know, what's interesting is that cloth is really important for the accomplishment of this, that fine mats and cloaks, which are made by women, are brought out at key points in the life course, at birth, at marriage, and death, and they help to make some people more person than others. So if you're an aristocratic baby, there will be a ceremony where a fine mat that's been made by, you know, your ancestral women will be brought out. You, the baby, will be sat on it. There'll be some kind of naming ceremony or kind of ritual office ceremony that transmits this ritual office to you. But part of it, you're also getting that kind of magic personhood, life force juju from the mat itself. The mats are transacted at marriages. The mats come out on the occasion of death, that if you're an important person, they'll bring these mats. You know, friends will bring mats to your house to kind of comfort you and it's interesting, the mats come to comfort you for the loss of a life, right? And these are mats that are lent, and then the family, it's like they make a visit and then they're taken back by the family. But also at the same time that this mat is comforting you, this mat is also being charged with kind of person force, right? This is the famous mat that this king sat upon as a baby. This is the famous mat that visited the house of so-and-so when they died. This is the mat that was transacted to make this marriage. So the mats themselves absorb life force, and they're very important to the transfer of aristocratic privilege. Okay, she also writes about the symbolism of cloth making that is interestingly linked to women's fertility. And I'm going to give the examples she gives from Oceania, but actually others have looked into this, and you find these kinds of patterns, not exactly the same language, but these affiliations are found elsewhere. So cloth making is interestingly linked to women's fertility. So she talks about Maori kahu cloaks. This is the former Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, wearing a kahu cloak, which is these special feathered cloaks. Not just anybody can wear them, right? You have to be a big deal to have the right to wear a kahu cloak. The same word is used for the membrane surrounding the fetus. Kahu kahu is a word for, according to her, in Maori, the germ of a human being, the spirit of a deceased ancestor, a stillborn infant, and the cloth used by women during menstruation. So you can see this kind of fertile power going into being associated with cloth that kind of transmits life itself. The word for loom supports that are kind of the sticks that go into the ground that you weave things on is the same word for these sticks that apparently women hold on to when they're giving birth. So you give birth to babies and you give birth to cloth. Certain kinds of religious carvings made out of wood, they are imbued with the life of the god only when they're dressed. So that you put the cloth around them, and then the god occupies that carving, and then when you take the cloth off, it's just a wood carving again. Okay. So using Weiner in a way that I think she actually was worried about being used this way, that like, oh, you know, I'm interested in this theory, but she didn't want to do something social evolutionary. She definitely didn't want to do something radical feminist, even though I think she could see her work lent itself in that direction so strongly. But if you start to think about cloth women and status throughout history, you start to see some of the themes that Weiner noticed recur again and again. So Weiner was kind of reluctant to take her work where it was leading. She actually has like little passages where she warns off about that. She was publishing in the 90s where there's huge backlash against any, you know, radical feminism was supposedly essentialist, blah, blah, blah. She developed a theory where she was really careful to talk about objects and persons and gender, not about sex. But if you start to think with some of Weiner's ideas, you can look again at many other things. So I think probably many of you have read Gerda Lerner's creation of patriarchy. She wrote, she was a feminist historian. She wrote a wonderful book about patriarchy as something that has a history. And her vision of patriarchy is something that emerged with the first empires. She really looked at Mesopotamia, the sort of the world of the Mediterranean in general. And she talked about female enslavement, that women were in these first empires, the first records that you have of slaves, the slaves are all female, and what they're really being exploited for is their reproductive capacity, because you want to take the ability of women to create new persons, and men want to, and empires want to appropriate that power, and they want to say the only kind of people who really count as people are people recognized by the patriarchs. The kind of people created just by slave women are nothing. Like, slave women are non-persons and they can only create non-persons. The only real people are people who are attached to the patriarchy. We're going to expropriate women's reproductive powers. And we're going to also deny women's ability to create real persons. I think she's correct about all of this. But if we go back to Barber, and with also Weiner in mind, Barber pointed out that the main daily activity of female slaves in ancient empires was the production of cloth well into old age. So it wasn't like slave empires only wanted sexy reproductive slave girls. They didn't kill women generally. They were like, all of you are going to make cloth. That cloth was incredibly important to the foundation of the earliest empires. And again, there's a combination of hard and soft. So when we talk about the Bronze Age, a metal element that was really important for making bronze was tin, and tin wasn't available everywhere. So tin is you can only find tin in certain sites. And so the trade in tin was really important to Bronze Age empires. But Barber said, whenever they're trading tin, they're also trading cloth. Part of this is practical. If you have your camels or whatever moving your caravan goods around, it can't be all tin because it's too heavy. So a caravan that's carrying like a bunch of tin and a bunch of cloth is actually something that the animals can drag along. But the cloth is also really valuable. It's a really valuable trade good, but it's also a really important symbolic medium. So here's a Sumerian carving. Part of the way you can tell that this guy is a bigger deal than these guys is he's literally bigger than them. That's often a representative shorthand for like, I'm a big deal, you're crap. But look, he's also, his outfit is much cooler than their outfit. Like, he has a much nicer kind of garment on. So again, cloth as this thing that says, I'm more person than you are. Okay, so when we think of the history of humanity, we think of Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, these hard ages. But soft stuff was also important. Cloth was also traded. Cloth was also useful, highly valued, but above all, it was symbolically important. Long before empires have writing and documents, cloth is a medium that can convey messages about status. So how does a society permanently transmit the message that some people are more person than others? Some people have a right to more cloth than others. Some people have a right to more special kinds of cloth than others. And you see this again and again. You can think about Imperial China and the Silk Road, like how important was silk to the building of some of the early empires. But another example, you can look anywhere in the world. You can look at the Inca Empire. Cloth was the Inca Empire didn't have writing, but it had a bureaucracy, it had documentation. There was like a textile technology of writing. But also cloth itself, there were the institution of the so-called aclaconas, who were women brought from all over the Inca Empire, young women, beautiful young women who were brought to Cusco and lived there until they were elderly and died. And they spent their lives making a special kind of cloth that was only for Inca aristocrats. So I would say cloth is the first fetish in the Marxist sense of an object that is imbued, that onto which human powers are projected. Like, aha, how am I a big deal? Because how can I make people? How can I appropriate the fertile powers of women? Because the cloth says that I can. But also in the sex hang-up sense. I mean, I think fetish has those two senses for a really good reason. Okay, to go back to Gerda Lerner, she noted that one mark of slave status was that Mesopotamian slave women were not allowed to wear clothes. And there's a lot of lurid speculation about like, because you wanted to look at the sexy slave girls and have sex with them. Probably you did if you were a man. But also, this was like the mark of not being a person. Like you are denuded of personhood. The people who are more person have the fancy cloth. The people who are non-persons have no cloth. And this is, it's not just sexy slave girls who are naked, right? It's old slave ladies who've spent their lives making textiles. And then eventually, once you have a permanent slave class, it's also boys and men. How can you tell that person is not a person? They're not allowed to wear any cloth. How can you tell that the Inca is a big fucking deal? Because look at his cloth. It's amazing, right? Super fancy and decorated. In empire after empire, special cloth means special person. Okay, just I'm running longer than I meant to. I'll let you guys think about the Rumple Stillskin story, the link between like what is the woman who's supposedly be able to weave, and it's all men who say that she can weave cloth into gold. What does she have to give up in order to accomplish this thing that is not really possible to do? She has to promise her firstborn child. So this link between weaving and fertility, anyway, there's a wonderful essay, a 1991 essay by Jane Snyder. Okay, but this isn't just ancient empires. This isn't just folk tales. This is also, if we think about the industrial age, you know, Marx's analysis of like the worker, the canonical worker is a man, but in fact, the Industrial Revolution was built on the backs of non-persons, slave labor in the colonies, growing cotton, and young women, fertile young women in those dark satanic mills making cloth. And it's amazing how often it recurs. So trade in cloth, control of cloth, always goes alongside making some people non-people, and it has a fetishistic association with women's, the fertile powers of young women. And it's not really that different now, right? So the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh in April 2013, this was a garment factory, shoddily constructed building that pancaked on top of more than 1,000 garment workers. The overwhelming majority were young women, because who's making the garments? It's still young women. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up now. As radical feminists, we notice the fetishization of women in the sex trade. We notice the theft of women's fertility and surrogacy. We notice the denial of personhood to women. We notice men transferring women's personhood to themselves via clothing fetishes. We're not wrong to think these things are connected. So think of Drag Queen Story Hour. This is a symbolic occasion on which what is acted out is men's ability to do nurturance. It's male motherhood. It's men doing nurturance better than women do nurturance. And how do you know? Because they allow children to be their real selves, right? They give birth to genuine children who really are their real, actual, genuine selves. So like biological mothers create crappy little flesh beings who are not real persons. But you go to a drag queen to make you a real person, right? Now I'm my real self after my drag queen mother has mothered me. And why do high status people drag their kids to these occasions? Because they understand the symbolism, right? They understand the status symbolism involved in this. It's alma mater all over again. So some of you have heard an earlier talk by me. Why is the university your alma mater? It's the mother of your soul. You're like a little flesh peasant when you go into the university, but you come out high class, high status degree. You've been born again at a spiritual level, and the university is the mother of your soul. Drag Queen Story are same shit. RuPaul's Drag Race. Drag Race finalists address their younger selves. This is continued the idea that like, oh, I'm telling little persons, it's okay, you can be your real self. Like I know that your whole process of birth and nurturance, you didn't become your real self through that process. But now me dressed as a lady, I'm speaking to myself, but also it's a message to the audience about real nurturance and real personhood, and who has it and who can bestow it onto others. Men. And how do they? Because they've got the cloth on themselves, the special cloth that makes them more person. And the women who made the babies, made the cloth, but they don't, they're either not allowed to wear the cloth, or when they wear the cloth, they don't wear it right. I wear it right. Okay, this is same shit, right? This is like Zeus giving birth. This is Gerda Lerner stuff about male motherhood. Zeus giving birth to Athena through his head, and some other critter some other critter comes out of his thigh. Male mothers, real genuine personhood. You became your real self through the agency of RuPaul's Drag Race. Is for men and provided only by men. This is getting worse, but it isn't new, right? It's the same old shit, and it really is all connected. Radical and being sort of disarmed from the ability to do that detective work and understand those connections. Of course, they're telling young people, and especially young women, oh my God, don't think in that way. They want you to be born yesterday to a man. And they don't want you to have they don't want you to know the connections. They don't want you to know the sequence of mothers. Well, you guys, I mean, here I'm really preaching to the choir. So anyway, that's why I think cloth is actually the original fetish. It is in both the sense of attributing human powers to an object, and why it's such a sexual fetish and such a deep, old, powerful sexual fetish. All right. Thank you so much. I look forward to whatever time we have for discussion.
Right. Kathleen, I think that's you. That's the real you now. I need to, I don't know. Yes, you can see you, and I'll put me on as well. Add spotlight. There we are. So we're both there. That was just amazing. I'll just check with Sheila. Sheila, do you want to join in and ask any questions or make any points?
Not anything I can think of at the moment, no.
Okay, so that's fine. So I had there were a couple of points that came up in the chat that people were asking about, and I'll also ask a couple of questions that I came up with. One is somebody said could those be menstrual cloths? When you showed the picture of saying like this, they're wearing maybe aprons, but somebody said could they be menstrual cloths?
Some of them probably yes. I know with the Venus of Lesbia, I didn't show a great image of that. It's actually the woman is wearing that thing behind, and what's one of the things that's interesting is it's suspended from her hips and it's kind of under her bottom. It doesn't look like it would actually work as a menstrual cloth. Like it's that one at least. Some of them probably are. That one at least looks like, I think these can be practical objects, but I think, and I feel, you know, when I watch this, I think, oh, I sound kind of like a crazy person. But I do think that having a fetish object, like a medium that says, I now have the power to make people, right? Like I now have that. I've expropriated. I look at those things and I think this moment might be one of the things that's important for that shift, because if we think that it looks like, and I think this is right, that women's status was higher, but then with the rise of these empires, something happens where women's people-making capacity gets expropriated. And that's really, you have to, it's not just a different way of thinking about people. It really requires, there had to be some kind of symbolic thinking through of, oh no, that no longer is something that's special about women. It's actually something that belongs to men.
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose, but when you're saying this sort of object, that a lot of the capacity to make people then transfers to the clothes or to the so if men wear the clothes or babies are put on the clothes, then it has all that aura around it, or that and it's taken away from women.
Yeah, and if and we can think about, I think it's interesting that we can think about fetishism in two senses, in the kind of the sort of Marxist fetishism that the object is imbued with, like, you think that it's actually the worker who makes all the stuff, but the stuff seems to confront us as if it was magically made because it all comes from factories. And that kind of fetishism where we've imbued an object with a power that actually comes from us. But I think there's simultaneously this sexual fetishism that we can see how fetishistic in that sexual sense women's clothes are. And I think there's actually like a long backstory to that.
Yeah. And then can you tell us, you didn't tell us, can you explain a bit more about this Rumple Stillskin story? You did it very quickly, but it'd be great if you could explain it more.
Right. So Jane Snyder's essay, she actually analyzes Rumple Stillskin in terms of the specific context of the transition to capitalism in Europe. I think she might be wrong about how old the Rumpelstiltskin story is. I think it's probably older. I think they've done some analysis of sort of folk tales, and some of them are quite old, and Rumpelstiltskin is one that's quite old. But she's interested exactly in this transition to capitalist cloth production and how much it involved women's work changing, women becoming industrial workers, young women becoming industrial workers. So she interprets Rumpelstiltskin as a story about what young women are doing, and instead of using their fertile powers in a traditional way, they're becoming industrial workers and they're making cloth. So she interprets it specifically in the context of this transition in industrial capitalism. But I think it also works if we think about this as, if the Rumpelstiltskin story is older, sort of a long folk tradition that people have had of this idea of the cloth that women produce and the babies they produce being interchangeable in some ways, and both being something that men can expropriate, right? that these are things that women put their energies into, and they can be expropriated, transacted among men. Men can sort of behave as if they are the real authors of these things, because it's interesting that, and I'm not the first person who's observed this, but Marx, even his whole analysis of capitalism, he talks about the linen coat, but the worker that he's always has in mind is a man, where the worker who was at the heart of industrial production really was a cloth worker and was a woman.
Yeah, so I mean, that fits in with my feeling about Marx, and I think a lot of us feel that the point of his writing was to big up industrial men, to make them the saviors, and the people that the working class man are like Jesus or something. They're the heroes that we should be bowing to, and that would fit, wouldn't it? So he can't see that women are doing all this work because it doesn't fit with his purpose, which is for us to adore the revolutionary hero. So he has to put him center of the story and sort of disappear us. Yeah. Okay, so I've got another question. Anthropology, from what I infer from what you're saying now, is talking about gender. not sex. And there's probably okay, I'll say what I think and tell me if it's true, that there's probably pretty much zero space to talk about sex, and it's all about gender. So how does that break the study of anthropology? How does it sort of make it an unhelpful sort of academic area?
Yeah, I mean, I think and this is not a new observation, but I think we have all this. I mean, I do think, and Sheila has written about this, but that there's this moment in the 1970s where feminism is really having an impact on academic work, that there's this mode of analysis that it's like, we have all this accumulated evidence, we have these modes of analysis where we could interpret these evidence and we could kind of crack some things about the human story generally. And I don't know, I feel like I sound like a nut, but I just think it's true. Or at least in my academic life, I definitely would sound like a nut saying this. It's nice to be here where I can say it and no one isn't immediately horrified. But there's this moment where we could turn this feminist way of thinking on this huge body of literature we have, this enormous accumulation of evidence we have about cross-cultural ethnography from cross-cultural situations, archaeological research, and suddenly, no. You can't, that's essentialist. Who even knows what women are? We can't think in those terms. We can't interpret the evidence in ways that are so suggestive because you're being ethnocentric, or you have to think. All the categories become all the categories of thought become sort of forbidden to use. Oh, what do you mean women? Like, what is a woman? Like, we don't even know what a woman is. Like, what are you talking about? And so suddenly I do feel like there's this evidence and you're the detective, and suddenly you're like, oh, what even is homicide? Like,
Yeah.
what are you even trying to figure out? Like,
Wow.
when you're you're at a moment where you really could solve some basic fundamental things about how society has come to be structured. And suddenly you're not allowed to, and then of course they don't say you're not allowed, but they say, oh, it's, that's a bit,
it's so sophisticated.
Unsophisticated and silly if you're gonna say you know what a woman is. Like, well, are you really allowed to hang out with the cool kids? And you think, oh, it just seems so strategically obvious why you would do that. And I even think somebody like Annette Weiner, it's really, to me, it's very sad because her work in the 70s is terrific and brilliant and angry. And her work in the 90s, she's obviously so interested in these questions. And then suddenly in the 90s, she knows which way the wind is blowing. And so she has these cautions in her own work about, oh, of course I don't mean anything essentialist. I don't mean anything social evolutionist. And you think, oh, but your work, it would be so interesting if you did, because this would be quite explanatory. And yeah, and I know Barber's work, which is sort of more old-fashioned in the sense that she's just really interested in the material, but she's not really a theorist. And so she doesn't care about those kinds of fights, which makes her work in a way more useful. But there were a lot of really sniffy reviews of her, even though her work didn't end up being hugely influential, just because she'd noticed something so interesting, like cloth is everywhere. It's really important. These sniffy reviews that are like, well, but she is interested in sort of social evolutionist forms of explanation that say these technologies advance and they have relationships to how societies develop. And the reviews don't say she's wrong. They're just like, oh, it's a bit old-fashioned,
Yeah. So there's a question in the Q&A. It says, you mentioned Zeus and Athena. Have you anything to add about Arachnne?
Oh, that's, you know, I hadn't thought about it, that she's the weaver who gets in trouble, right? She's kind of the woman weaver who challenges a god and gets, I I think one could, I mean, now that you say that, I don't know whose question that was. I think a fascinating essay could be written, but actually it had not occurred to me. I don't know if that's the direction that person wanted to go, but Arachnne, the very skilled woman weaver, but don't, um, it's a little bit of like, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't think you're any big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
She's the, if for people who don't know, it's the myth of the woman who says she's better than Athena at weaving, and then they have a contest, and Athena turns her into a spider. That's why we call.
yeah.
I do
I
have
mean,
something to say to
that question came from Ray, who does these fantastic weaving, web weaving workshops. And what I've noticed I've been to two of them, they're just brilliant, where you get balls of wool and you sort of weave a spider's web across the room, is what happens to women in the group, what we talk about and what links we make. And it's just magical what happens when we are weaving this thing together. And that's an insight, I suppose, into our, when we do this collectively, when we do weaving collectively, what we do together, which again is something that I'm sure they don't want us to be up to. Yeah. Okay, so I've got a question which is related to that. How do we break out of this pattern system that you've described?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, this is the one, I know you had that Substack about I don't know if you read my comment about women's. I have really mixed feelings about, because in some ways I think we don't, of course, when we see men wearing women's clothing in a fetishistic way, we really understand what a trap women's clothing is, right? Because it's so fetishized and it traps you in this dynamic. At the same time, is the answer, I worry that the answer is not to just give it up, right? Because if we say, well, we're just going to hand over clothing to men, you know, like, all right, that's like, you guys get excited. We're just going to wear plain gray homespun, because every time we try to wear something nice, you turn it into something gross that oppresses us. But I think, is that the answer? Or I just think we need to take the cloth back, like both literally, symbolically, like we get to wear beautiful things that belong to us, that don't get fetishized by men.
Yeah,
You know,
and there's
I want it
definitely, I
all
mean,
back. Right?
Mary
I don't.
Daly, yeah, Mary Daly's writing sort of says that there's this sort of goddess shimmering behind that breaks through, and it's a very, very powerful thing. And it's, I suppose, it's the you know, what we can be, and this creative thing, which can sometimes come through with clothes, and stereotypically women's clothes. So I think it's a very complicated argument, isn't it? Because it's also women's oppression, and where do we
Right.
come down on it? Okay, look, we've only got 1 minute left, and I've got a final question. Where can we get more Kathleen Lowrey stories and podcasts and info? Do you have a channel or a Substack, or do you make regular videos, please?
You know, I have a Substack, but my Substack is so I mean, I do have one essay that's about cloth type stuff on my Substack, but a lot of my Substack is, you know, totally Edmonton, Canada related stuff about bathroom policy. Like it's a real, my Substack is a very mixed bag. I am perpetually working on this book that includes, you know, some of this analysis that you know, it just seems I never seem to get it finished, but someday it will come out. So I would love it if people
But
were
isn't that
interested.
relevant? Isn't there some woman who spins all night and then it gets unspun or something? You're that.
Yeah. No,
you're
I
that
mean, this
person.
is there's no man at fault here. That's just me not writing as much as I should. But yeah, I think, there's not so much me stuff, but if you I think my last slide, maybe we didn't get to, it was just the references. I certainly, anybody who hasn't read Elizabeth Whelan Barber's book, it's a terrific read. It inspired me to try to learn to use a loom. I just make the same stupid nubbly scarf over and over again. I never get any better, but maybe that is a metaphor for my book.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've come to the end of the time. Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was
Yeah.
absolutely brilliant. There was a very nice comment, which I'm just going to read out, from Sue, saying, splendid fibrous web from Kathleen.
That's high praise, high praise.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Well,
So
thanks
thank
so
you, and
much for the
thank you for the
invite.
middle
It's
of the
always a
night
pleasure.
turning up, and sleep
Okay.
well.
All right. Thanks a
Bye,
lot.
everybody else.
Bye-bye.
Okay.